Well, as the title there on the screen or in the bulletin says, this is part 2 of a 2-part sermon. So let's do a bit of review from last week, real quick here. We spoke about French philosopher Paul Ricoeur, who wrote that a person or a culture tends to move over time from a first naivete through a period of critical thought and deconstruction of that first naivete to a second, far more mature, but also naivete. And we looked at the word naive, meaning natural, unadulterated. The first naivete is the experience of children hearing myths and legends and Bible stories for the very first time. And kids encounter these stories at face value, like any other story that they might hear. You know, Santa Claus, the Easter Bunny. They don't question whether the stories really happened, whether Noah's Ark really held 2 kinds of every animal, or whether a multitude of the heavenly host appeared to the shepherds of Bethlehem. Beautiful stories. Kids generally take them at face value. This really happened. It happened exactly like that, because that's what they're told. And this first naivete serves us pretty well for a while. But of course, people and churches and cultures can get stuck in that stage of development and never grow out of it. A childish faith. And plenty of folks still have that. But usually as we grow older, we subject cultural and religious stories to critical scrutiny, and we begin to wonder whether the stories actually happened in real time and space just the way they're told. It's the, wait a minute, moment. Wait a minute, stage of development. The historical critical stage. And this is a healthy, normal, and absolutely necessary for growing up mentally, emotionally, and spiritually. Almost everybody goes through this. If you've been to any kind of school or the school of hard knocks or simply just being alive, you're going to go through this period of criticism. But many people, including academics and writers, comedians and media moguls, often get stuck in this stage as well. The popular atheists like Sam Harris, Richard Dawkins, even Christopher Hitchens, whose books sell in the millions. More popular comedians like Bill Maher, Ricky Gervais, George Carlin, who I just love, get stuck in the religion is childish mythology stage of development. Paul Ricoeur called this the desert of criticism. You get stuck there. You get stuck wandering, asking the questions. Oh, we can't believe that. That's childish. And like I said last week, I admire the social criticism that these people offer, helping us through both reason and humor to get past the dangerous myths that North Americans, Europeans and so forth so strongly believe. But the constant sneering at religion is kind of sophomoric, and it's stunted imagination. They stay on the surface level of the stories and never get beneath. It's a state of perpetual adolescence, an ongoing rebellion, against the parental ego mass. And my reaction to reading these critics or watching their comedy routines is, after I, laugh heartily, I say, yeah, you're right. But hey, grow up. You're missing out on a lot. You're missing out on a lot if you just dismiss these stories as childish things. See, we who have committed ourselves to following Jesus, or even toyed with the idea of following Jesus, don't have any excuse to hide behind sophomoric dismissal. The message of Jesus is that heaven and earth are not really separated, even though it may seem that way. Jesus acts out this presence of the divine, for lack of a better word, in his own backyard. he demonstrates that the Logos, the God utterance that we find in John chapter 1, has become flesh and moved into the local campground. That's the main story of Christmas. And it's easy to forget what the main story of Christmas is. That's what it is. The Word became flesh, moved into the local campground. Now, let's remember that Jesus didn't speak every language. He spoke his local language, whatever that was. Jesus didn't live everywhere. He demonstrated the realm of God in a tiny territory in the Middle East. He didn't address every issue, though certain politicians like to pretend that he did. But no, he didn't. There's a whole lot left unsaid in the teachings of Jesus. Rather, Jesus changed the world by coming to understand the promises of God, acting on them, and demonstrating them in his locality, touching the people he crossed paths with on any ordinary day. So here is what Jesus taught his followers, at least according to the Gospel of Luke. So as we listen to Nick read this short lesson, we'll hear him say the phrase, Son of Humanity, Son of Man in most translations. This is a concept from the Old Testament prophets Ezekiel and Daniel, and it refers to a human being who completely understands the fusion of heaven and earth, of human and divine. Let's hear this.
Jesus, grilled by the Pharisees on when the realm of God would come, answered, "The realm of God doesn't come by counting the days on the calendar, nor when someone says, 'Look here,' or 'There it is.' And why? Because God's realm is already within you, already among you." He went on to say to his disciples, "The days are coming when you are going to be desperately homesick for just a glimpse of one of the days of the Son of Humanity, and you won't see a thing. And they'll say to you, 'Look over there,' or 'Look here.' Don't fall for any of that nonsense. The arrival of the Son of Humanity is not something you go out to see. He simply comes. You know how the whole sky lights up from a single flash of lightning? That's how it will be on the day of the Son of Humanity."
Yeah, and that's the second naivete that can be reached after going through the desert of criticism, doubt, and atheism. It's a second embracing of the spiritual wisdom in which we take responsibility for our own beliefs, our own actions and practices, not just what our parents and preachers and Sunday school teachers told us to believe. Not to mention coaches and CEOs and advertising. After we've sifted through everything that's passed as religion, this essential wisdom is what remains, like a candle glowing in the dark or a rose blossoming in the snow. This is a childlike faith as opposed to a childish faith. The difference may seem subtle at first, but it really isn't. They're really several kilometers apart. Now, Jesus teaches that the realm of God isn't something you go out and see. It simply comes. And I love the analogy here, like a flash of lightning. And we become aware of it. The second naivete is the same thing. It's an awareness of what is, always was, and ever shall be. An awareness that there really is no separation between God and humanity, nor between humans and humans. What seems like separation is only in our critical, adolescent imagination. That's what we talked about last week. Okay, now, for this week. How do we begin to live in the second naivete? How do we begin to live there? Well, like I said last week, I don't know. But I have some inklings, some suspicions, some glimmers and intimations. Let's try this on for size. In the newsletter, we talked about the second naivete being like, yes, Virginia, there is a Santa Claus. Did you read that? Here's another way of looking at it. Maybe it's like being in a big chorus, a big choir. If you've ever sung in the choir, or if you sing in one now, you know exactly what I'm talking about. Last time I was in a massive choir was 3.5 years ago in the August before I moved to this sweet and smoke-free place in the world. Marcia and I were in a big combined choir with people all over the West Coast, 140 voices or so. I don't know, it was so huge I didn't count. For a performance of Carl Orff's Carmina Burana, which, is classical music's rock concert. This is like Bohemian Rhapsody times 100. It was held at an outside venue called the Brit Festival, an actual rock venue stage, on a hillside outside Medford, Oregon, with full orchestra, children's choir, the whole deal. And I don't know how many people would show up at these things. Many, thousands, a lot. All on the grass out there in this stage at the bottom of the hill. Now, on the evening of the performance, there were fires all over southwestern Oregon, and it was about 38 degrees. And the smoke was so thick that we on the stage couldn't see the audience out there on the lawn. And the sweat and the smoke made it feel kind of like Woodstock. How many of you were at Woodstock? Oh, yeah, of course you were. But people turned out despite the smoke and the heat. I was kind of amazed. And the ovation after the thing was over was a rush, as if the choir and the orchestra were the Rolling Stones or something. Now, when you're in a big chorus like that, or even a smaller one like our choir here, not only do you have to know the music, whether you sing it well or not, you have to know it, and you have to watch the director. Whether you agree with his or her interpretation or not. Now, you choir directors present, not only Heather, but there's a number of you here that have directed choirs. You know what I mean. And how important it is to watch the director and to go where she is going. The music has to go through the director, right? From the choir, through the director, out to the audience or the congregation. Before that hot August night, I'd been in the Southern Oregon Repertory Singers off and on for over 10 years, singing some full seasons and some partial seasons. But over those years, I spent a whole lot of time looking intently and listening intently to the director, whose name was Paul French, professor of choral and vocal studies there at the local university in Oregon. And he was the director of the choral portions of that Carmina concert. And I spent hours eyeballing Dr. French's arms and hands and face over the top, of a piece of sheet music. So we got the music here, and we hold it up, and, I'm looking at him over the top of this thing for a decade. And when I wasn't looking at him, I was afraid he was looking at me and wondering why I wasn't looking at him. When the singers weren't looking at him, he'd raise his formidable voice and say, "You have to let the music go through me. Don't be singing your own thing." So as we were learning the Carmina Burana throughout July of that year, he drilled us in how to find our notes between movements when the key changed, and sometimes quite dramatically. Have a plan, he'd tell us. Have a plan. Know how to get from G major to D minor when no instrument is going to give you the note. You have to hear it in your head and come in confidently in the next movement. And he gave us some strategies on how to do that. Told us to pick one strategy and use it until it became natural. Don't guess, he'd yell, without a trace of a smile. Know what you're doing. Don't drag, he warned. And don't rush. In other words, be right on time as the director is marking the time. Now, if you've heard Carmina Burana, and I know several of you have sung it in the past years right here in Edmonton, you know that it's sung in Latin and medieval German. And the words come fast and furious. And so Paul's advice was to memorize the words. Yeah, sure. Memorize the words, at least of our entrances, so that we can keep watching the director as we come in for our entrance. And to the relief of many of us, he said, you don't have to sing every note. You don't have to spit out every word. It's a great big choir, and people will carry you sometimes, and you'll carry others sometimes. This is advice I drank of liberally, especially in that men's section of chanted Latin about what it's like to quaff ale, throw dice, and lose your shirt in a medieval tavern. That's why this piece is so popular. It's about a bunch of monks who... no, never mind. But the words are, quidam ludunt, quidam bibunt, quidam indiscrete vivunt, and it goes on and on and on and on for seemingly a half hour. And a couple of places in that ridiculously difficult movement, I just sang the accented syllables. Quid, lud, quid, bib. Because my mouth would simply not move that fast, even though I'd studied the words over and over and I knew them cold. And then at the end of the rehearsals, Paul would often rhapsodize about how wonderful it is to be part of something greater than yourself, a unified, accomplished choir that creates powerful art out of a crowd of local people. Well, even untrained, small-voiced singers like me who weren't music majors and didn't learn all this in our youth can keep learning in our 60s, our 70s, and our 80s. New ways of creating something beautiful and powerful and satisfying. Each choir member, from high soprano to low bass, I was second tenor, couldn't help but sing our minds and our hearts out for this guy. Just like our choir here cannot help but sing our hearts out for our director, who we love, who we have spent decades staring into the face of over sheet music. Well, here's the point. It's exactly the same in our spiritual lives. Have a plan when the hard sections come. When life changes from major to minor, have a plan. The movements in life change key so quickly and sometimes abruptly. Memorize sections of Jesus' teachings so that you can keep your eyes on the director as you're living your life when you have to enter in a difficult situation. When Jesus says, as he does in Mark 1:15, turn around and believe the good news. Well, do your textual Greek criticism if you want, and I certainly encourage that, but then go with it. Accept that. Turn around and believe the good news. And don't guess about Matthew 18:19. Don't guess. Know what it says. Know what it says. Know what it promises you. Don't guess about Mark 11:23. The promises are huge, and they're fulfilled every day in each of us in big ways and small. Know what it promises you. Go ahead, do your criticism, historical, critical, textual, linguistic, but then believe the promise. Know what Jesus teaches in Matthew chapter 6 and follow those teachings in a naive yet mature way, not worrying about whether Jesus delivered the Sermon on the Mount all at one time, whether he was sitting or standing, how faithful the usual English translation is to Jesus' Aramaic. It might be fun, but it doesn't really matter. And you don't have to know every biblical promise. You don't have to remember that Luke 12 parallels Matthew 6 and has little interesting differences that fascinate biblical scholars. That stuff just doesn't matter unless you're a Bible nerd and you do it for fun, like a couple of people you could mention. No, this is the advent of living life by a mature second naivete. Not just believing, but knowing. And knowing that we know that we live in the realm of God, that healing and comfort and community is available to us, that the right prayer, the right word, the right action, the right attitude is all available to us when we need it, at the moment that we need it, even as the world seems to be turning sour around us. It won't rush, but it won't drag either. It will be right on time as the director is marking time within us. And we're going to need the right word. We're going to need the right action. We're going to need the right attitude, the right prayer in these coming months and years. We all know that the climate is disrupted and changed. Not only the physical climate with the wind and the weather and the temperature and all that, but also the political, the cultural, the financial, the spiritual climate is different now than when many of us grew up, or even from 10 years ago. Things may not be as easy as we press into the future. And we all know that, whether we care to acknowledge it or not. So we can live the way that Jesus told us we can live. We can know that naively. Or not. And we can just suffer. We can live the way that Jesus told us we can live. So let's allow the advent of that way of life dawn on us, as we naively know the sun will come up in the late morning. Amen.
Amen.